So welcome everyone to SEEE's webinar this morning on starting a social venture and different legal structures. And we're very pleased to welcome Emma Millar from Taylor Vinters, who's very kindly given up her time today. And we've worked with Emma before, and we know what a brilliant source of knowledge she is, and she'll have some really good advice for you all. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat during the webinar, and we'll also take questions at the end. And just to let you know, we have a range of other webinars this week at SEEE. You can have a look on our website. They're all free, have been throughout this week on different types of things that we hope your social enterprise will find useful. So please have a look at those. So I'll hand over to Emma now. And if you want to share your screen, Emma.
Yeah, sure. So just you see me. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So yes, delighted to be working with Jane and SEEE and giving you a bit of my knowledge about setting up social ventures. We have a charities and social ventures department within Taylor Vinters. We're a multi-service law firm working with not-for-profits, which I've been doing for just over 10 years. So yes, without further ado, let's kick off today's presentation. So today we are talking about setting up social ventures, and particularly focused on why you might look to set one up and how you go about doing so. So as I say, I've introduced myself, just giving you a little bit of an overview about me. So what we'll be covering today is looking at social ventures, particular focus on the legal structures and company as the vehicle for taking that structure forward, thinking around some of the key decision-making factors in choosing the right model for you, and a little bit of a legal checklist just to give you some starters for 10 as to what you also might need to think about really to kind of get initial operations off the ground and give you a really good solid foundation to build on for your social enterprise. So without further ado, social ventures. I wanted to just start off with a quote from Karen Lynch. She's the chief exec of water company Millar, who you may have come across. So Millar are a social enterprise, but they work essentially by donating all of their distributable profits to WaterAid and other similar water-based charitable organisations. They're also very focused on an environmental mission and working ethically in their everyday business model. But she has this great quote, which I think is a really good starting point for encapsulating the thought process and the vision for social entrepreneurs. So you'll see that there on the screen, but just to reiterate, it's we must try to influence everyone running a business that there is a better way to do business. Rather than getting rich and then solve the world's problems, why don't we combine the two through the course of business rather than charity?
I have to listen to this, okay? Don't be fussy, okay? I'm supposed to.
And they each make a positive difference. So I think that really nicely captures the spirit of the social entrepreneur. And then where we see social enterprise in the sort of commercial landscape is sitting in between charities on the one hand and purely profit generating businesses on the other. So it occupies this middle ground, and I think it's a very wide scale, because actually there is no one size fits all for social ventures at all. It will very much depend on the nature of the business, whether you're trading or you're providing services, goods, skills, the right kind of legal vehicle that you choose, the extent to which you, for example, may want to or need to make a personal profit from the organisation. Obviously, we all have mortgages to pay and the like, or whether you are sitting more sort of on the entirely asset locked, dividend locked, pseudo charitable model, if I can put it that way. But we will certainly come back to this model later on in the presentation. I will sort of chart on where particular types of legal vehicles sit within that landscape. But also just to give a more general flavour for what I consider to make a social entrepreneur and a social venture is thinking about this equation. So you have an idea which is driven by a social or environmental purpose. That's the real sort of mission and driving force for the organisation. And you have an individual or a series of founders that have an entrepreneurial approach. They want to break out of the mold, achieve their social purpose by doing something of their own volition, perhaps a little bit different to what's gone before, and therefore that sort of entrepreneurial spirit, that innovation, leads to the creation of a social venture. So to put a little bit more flesh on the bones there, it tends to be those businesses that identify and demonstrate, as I say, an enshrined social purpose. They normally look to reinvest or direct surplus profits, as if, for example, it is slightly sort of outsourcing the impact that the organisation has to another entity. So, for example, in the Baloo water company instance that we mentioned at the outset, you could say there that essentially Baloo is outsourcing the impact it has, because it is furthering the mission of the charitable organisations that it helps fund through its business model. So the key questions for starting a social venture, first and foremost, we say governance. So it's sometimes useful to think about how regulated you might want the organisation to be, whether there is a benefit, particularly to external stakeholders, if there is seen to be some external impetus and oversight of the organisation from a credibility point of view. Or the flip side of that being actually whether you want to operate with relative flexibility. So, for example, if you were a company's house, albeit it is a regulator, is very light touch. So it has far less interest, really, in some ways, as to the way that you sort of manage the business on a day-to-day basis, and the purpose that you look to achieve. In terms of people, thinking about who's coming on board with the organisation, who are the right people to be involved. Now, obviously, that's going to be the founders at the outset, but there may be a point where you look to broaden out the people around the table. That might be bringing on other co-directors if you want to give other individuals sort of co-management responsibilities from an early stage. It might be looking to work with other sort of advisors or non-execs to build out the sort of sounding board expertise that you have for the organisation, but albeit not with direct some management responsibilities in the company. Or it may be sort of looking down the chain. So consultancies, if you need to sort of scale up the delivery of resources and services that you're offering, and you need to draft people on board to help you with that delivery. Or a more permanent solution would be the engagement of staff, looking to build up the organisation organically and internally from the ground up. Funding, really critical one, particularly thinking to the legal structures, which we'll come on to in a moment, but looking to think about how are you going to grow this business? What sources of funding will be right for you? And the key distinction there will be whether you will be looking to obtain and acquire grant funding, or whether you are looking at equity investment to scale up the business. Intellectual property won't be relevant for every business, but for some it may. So thinking actually, is the underpinning of the business idea very, very much wed to a novel piece of intellectual property, be that sort of the delivery of a service program, so the sort of marketing materials, the actual content that you create around the delivery of that service, for example. Or it could even be if you have a particularly snappy and distinctive brand that you want to begin to sort of scale up and protect and grow going forward. And last but absolutely by no means least would be purpose. So what is the organisation set out to do? What is the purpose you are looking to achieve? And keeping yourself on track with that, being very, very clear about how you define that purpose and how you will keep yourselves accountable in the delivery of that purpose. So what steps are you looking to achieve to realise that impact and that outcome? And that's particularly where a sort of theory of change concept can be really key at an early stage to help you sort of distill the decision-making process of what are we trying to change, who are we affecting along the ways, how are we, as I say, keeping ourselves on top of the landscape that we are working within to keep driving forward that change and momentum within the organisation. So that leads us quite nicely on to thinking about what legal structures might be right for us. So there's a few options set out here. We have partnerships, limited liability partnerships, community benefit societies. Now, I mentioned all of those pretty much in passing because by and large, they will not be the most obvious structure for you to adopt. So partnerships, there's two or more individuals that decide to run a business in conjunction with each other, but unlike a company, they will run the businesses essentially as individuals. There will be no limited liability, so anything that the organisation does will be undertaken in the names of those individuals. We have a slight sort of hybrid structure in the limited liability partnership, which is a partnership but does afford an independent legal personality to that entity, so it can contract in its own name and the like. But as I say, it's a slightly kind of quirky model. Law firms, for example, are typically structured as LLPs because of that sort of historical partnership model that they've grown from. Community benefit societies you would much more typically see with housing associations. They are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority rather than Companies House. So again, sort of slightly quirky and off to the side in the way and the visibility that they have in terms of regulation. So I would say 9.9 times out of 10, if you are looking about setting up a social venture, the underlying legal structure will be a private limited company. And there's a number of reasons for that. There's, as I say, 5 kind of key principles that are distilled as to why companies are so popular. First and foremost, I would say is simplicity. So it's very easy to set up a company. Just as I say, a sort of straightforward online process that can be managed directly with Companies House. It's a very kind of quick and efficient process, so you could have a company set up in a number of days. Well known because everybody essentially knows or has at least a general understanding of what a company is. So to the extent that you are then dealing with and contracting with third parties, they will also feel that bit more kind of comfortable with the familiarity of dealing with a company on the other side. Separate legal personality. So as I say, if the company is entering into contracts, if it's engaging staff, if it's unfortunate enough to have a dispute, all of that will sit and be the responsibility of the company itself. It won't fall on the directors in the background, which is also placed at the point about limited liability. So for example, if the company has a debt, that's a debt of the company that needs to be paid out of the assets of the company. It's not, unless we have sort of things that are underwritten personally by the directors, it shouldn't be debt collectors sort of knocking on your door to sort of make good the company's debts. And separation of ownership and management is an interesting one, because to set up a company, you would need to have directors, so the people that have day-to-day control for the management of the organisation. But you are entirely free to create other structures within the organisation. So whether that's something that's a delegated function. So for example, we mentioned an advisory board, if you might want to bring in non-executives as a sort of a sounding board for your decisions going forward. And actually that can be really helpful. It also means you can create a different class of members. So members in either or shareholders, and again they can be sort of separate from the directors with the day-to-day control and management. And to go into a little bit more detail on that, there are 2 types of company. We have a private company limited by guarantee, which is the traditional model used for corporate charities. It will have members rather than shareholders. It will still have directors in the same way as a traditional for-profit company. The key difference about a company limited by guarantee is that it doesn't have a share capital, a pretty fundamental difference there. Instead, on incorporation, the members will promise to contribute a nominal figure in the event of the company's winding up. And normally that's just £1 per member. And I have to say, actually, I've never actually even seen that called on to sort of make good any liabilities that a company may have at the point of winding up. And because it doesn't have a share capital, it's not eligible for equitable investment going forward. So thinking back to those sort of 5 precursors for what your right type of structure might be, if you're looking at equity investment and the granting of shares to scale up your organisation, clearly you can't be a company limited by guarantee because it just won't work. On the flip side, we have a company limited by shares, which has a shareholding. You can incorporate a company limited by shares, again, with a nominal share capital. So you can set a company up with a share capital of £1, and then look to broaden out the shareholding and put further sort of equity capital into the organisation as and when you need to. It will, as I say, have shareholders that will have sort of certain backstop constitutional powers, and it will have directors, again, for the day-to-day control of the organisation. And a company limited by shares is the typical structure that is adopted by for-profit companies, but we do also see a number of social businesses look to adopt this structure just because of the flexibility that it affords if they do potentially want to have equity investment, or the founders want to grant themselves dividends to earn some sort of income in addition to perhaps a salaried position within the organisation going forward. The point to bear in mind there, as I mentioned on the slide, is that yes, it would be eligible for equity investment, but it may be actually far trickier to persuade a traditional grant funder to fund a company limited by shares, because there is that possibility of private benefit by way of dividend payments being made out of the organisation. So yeah, I think a very kind of fundamental decision thinking about the right structure for you, if you don't have a company already set up, is in terms of funding. If this is going to be grant funded in the near future, a company limited by guarantee would probably be a better starting point. Equally, if you want to grant yourself shares in the company, or you want to potentially grant shares to other people at a later date, it needs to be a company limited by shares. So yes, just picking up on, again, those 5 points. So we've touched on funding. People, to be honest, there is no real fundamental difference in thinking through the people aspect as to whether you want to be a company limited by guarantee or a company limited by shares. The only point perhaps would be if you wanted to potentially incentivize staff by granting them shares. I have seen that for some organizations that wanted to create, as I say, some way to sort of give back to their staff, or create an attractive employment environment to bring people on board in the future. But I think that's quite a kind of rare and sophisticated model in itself. Governance for both, as I say, would potentially be largely the same if we were looking at just a company in itself, whether limited by shares or by guarantee. Your principal regulator will be Companies House, which, as I mentioned, is incredibly light touch. So other than needing to file annual returns and in your accounts, and needing to be kept abreast of any changes in, for example, who the directors are, there really isn't much that Companies House needs to know. Purpose in both Articles of Association, which is the governing document for a company, you could look to enshrine a social or environmental purpose. So really, as I say, that's sort of fairly similar between the two. And intellectual property could be protected and exploited by both organisations. Perhaps it may be, depending on the nature of the IP, if there was a more commercial leaning to it, you may want to consider a company limited by shares, just because it may be more attractive, again, to more traditional impact investors to come on board and to look to scale up that IP going forward. So how are social ventures funded? Well, there's a few ideas here. We've got investment. So as we've discussed, if you're looking to get third parties to come on board and put some capital into the organisation in return for an equity stake. Debt would be the traditional model of looking to have, for example, loans from a more traditional bank arrangement. Revenue, fairly critical, and one that actually you do see a number of organisations really sort of starting up with. So the sale of goods or services that they are looking to pursue to further their social mission. Grant funding, if you have an organisation that is eligible for grant funding, bearing in mind that some people consider grant funding to be free money because it's freely given, in the sense that the sort of strings attached are normally project based and still looking to further your social mission. So hopefully both parties are aligned in that vision. Just worth mentioning that actually it is quite important to ensure that grant funding is properly used in pursuance of the terms in which it's given, because otherwise it can be subject to clawback from the grantor. And actually a more pleasant trend that we've seen in the sector sort of post-COVID is, as I say, traditionally grant funding has very much been focused on project delivery. But some grant funders have seen that core costs actually are equally important to be funded, so would be happier to grant on an unrestricted basis for broad organisational costs that a social venture may have. We are also seeing some grant funders that are becoming more au fait with working with social ventures rather than just charities, and would be open to funding certain social ventures going forward. Again, there still may be some resistance if, for example, you were a company limited by shares that had an unrestricted ability to pay dividends because of that sort of private benefit as potentially sort of being a funnel to the grant funds being moved to a private individual. Crowdfunding operates in some ways like grant funding, but it's raising often sort of smaller scales of money from a larger group of people, and it could be sort of much more democratized in that way, but you may look to give more sort of smaller individual benefits to stakeholders who pledge a certain amount behind your mission that you're looking to further. And again, actually quite often that is project based, because that will be the point that sort of captures the imagination and gives a talking point for you to really sort of sell the story of what you are looking to deliver and achieve. Licensing and franchising would be more typical in an organisation that had valuable IP sitting as the sort of bedrock for the company idea. So licensing, whereby you allow another organisation to use your intellectual property, your business model, in return for a license fee or some sort of royalty sharing between the two organisations. That can be a very effective way to look to scale up quite quickly, bringing on other people on board with you, but not so much of the sort of immediate delivery risk, because you're passing that on to a third party to really sort of run with a particular sort of project or purpose. Franchising operates similarly, but it's more of a sort of trying to create a carbon copy of your business, but operated by another organisation. So it needs some quite careful management in terms of branding, to make sure that there's no sort of degradation to the brand and the name that you've set up, but also more fundamentally that you provide really clear instructions for how you want the business to operate, what the sort of internal policies are, what the ethical decision-making process is, so that really can be replicated by another organisation doing the same thing you are, really. So yes, a few models to consider there. So as I promised, yes, we will come back to this social venture scale and think about where particular types of legal vehicles sit within this scale. So on the one hand, we have a charity, and on the other, we have a purely profit-generating business, and we have this very wide stretch in the middle. So starting on the left-hand side, closer to the charity, we have a community interest company, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. Some of you may have already adopted this structure. It's very popular for social ventures for understandable reasons, because it was created as a bespoke legal model for this sector. and also, it does what it says on the tin. I've worked with a number of organisations that like the KIC model as an idea, because they use the name community interest company as a bit of a strapline for, this is what we do, this is what we're about, we are a community driven company. Now, just to give a little bit more detail for anyone that isn't aware, there are 3 types of community interest company, just to throw a little bit of mud in the water. So the first option would be to be a KIC that has as its legal structure a company limited by guarantee. So what you're creating there is almost something that is very, very close to a charity, albeit it has the slightly lower threshold of undertaking activities for a community purpose, rather than the Charity Commission's test of public benefit. So it's a lower threshold to meet that test. And also worth mentioning that KICs are regulated by the KIC registrar, who sits within Companies House. A little bit more onerous in terms of obligations, reporting obligations that a KIC will have. So it would expect annual reporting from a KIC to the extent that it has been undertaking activities in furtherance of its nominated community purpose, and will require updates in that. But it's nowhere near as parochial as the Charity Commission, so it still does give you a fair degree of operational freedom for what you want to do. The second model for a community interest company would be one that is limited by shares, but that has a complete lock on the payment of dividends. So albeit it has a share capital, but at the outset, the directors make the decision that they do not want to pay dividends to themselves, to anyone else, and therefore it's completely embargoed going forward. The third model is a company limited by shares that has the ability to pay some dividends. And the important distinction there is that those dividends are capped, and they're capped at 35%. So the shareholders of a community interest company that has a dividend cap can pay themselves up to 35% of the distributable profits from the organisation. And that ensures that the remaining 65% are either reinvested back into the KIC or otherwise used in furtherance of the nominated social or environmental purpose that the KIC has. So then you are ensuring really that, as I say, there is a purpose-driven vehicle here, and the organisation is using its assets, and particularly its sort of financial assets, cash at bank and the like, to pursue that mission. We then move on to a social enterprise, which is a broader term, but what I mean when I say that is thinking about Social Enterprise UK's definition of a social enterprise. So that would be a company limited by shares that allows a maximum cap of 50% of distributable profits to be taken out by way of dividends. So it's a 50-50 split between what could potentially go to the shareholders and what needs to be reinvested back into the business or otherwise in furtherance of that social purpose. We then move on to B Corps, which are a slightly different beast again. Again, you might be familiar with the term. They are really sort of coming on in leaps and bounds in terms of businesses sort of signing up to be B Corps. Normally, they would be companies limited by shares. There is no stipulation in terms of capping dividends, so you are free to pay 100% of distributable profits by way of dividends if you so desired. Where the B Corp really sort of finds its niche is that it has a very detailed questionnaire process to be awarded B Corp status, and that's based on 5 areas, key areas. So thinking about governance, environmental issues, sustainability, staff, and sort of engagement and work with other sort of customers and stakeholders. And the B Corp model requires a legal enshrinement in the Articles of Association, so the governing document of the company that sets out the social parameters of the business, and that the directors of the company pledge to take those sort of 5 areas into account in their decision-making process when thinking through any sort of commercial decisions for the business. So it absolutely has its place, and I completely understand why it's attractive to a number of organisations. It won't be right for everyone, I would say. Certainly for startup social businesses, B Corp has introduced its B Corp pending status for companies that are less than 12 months old, because normally you would need a minimum of a year's trading history behind you to be able to sort of properly fill out the due diligence questionnaire for B Corp status. But even for organisations that are over a year old, it is a very high threshold. If you look at some of the sort of players that are coming out with B Corp status now, there are some very, very big names. So Ben & Jerry's, Ella's Kitchen, Danone for certain elements of its business. So in some ways, these are the types of businesses that can have the infrastructure to really sort of put in place family-friendly policies, ethical supply chains. So that's not to say that it's not something to perhaps sort of work towards or be inspired by, but as I say, that sort of B Corp certification won't be right for everyone. And then again, moving slightly further over to the right, we have a slightly newer trend within the sector that you may have come across. So where an organisation pledges a percentage of its profit to a normally sort of philanthropic charitable cause. The most well-known, really, I would probably say, is 1% for the planet. So you have for-profit companies like Patagonia and the like that have decided to pledge 1% of the gross profits that the company has to partner environmental charities, and it's now a bit of a sort of wider movement that will look to sort of match corporates with charities where there's sort of synergies, shared ideologies, and it looks to put a little bit more sort of substance to perhaps a sort of more traditional ESG gloss, if you can put it that way, a marketing spin. So it is sort of funding some really sort of worthwhile projects and causes. But it is to say, it doesn't sort of have as its sort of underlying root cause this sort of social driver in the same way as a kick would, because it's not sort of fundamentally entrenched into the business in the same way. A few other things that it's worth mentioning just for your awareness for the sector as a whole. I did touch briefly on social enterprise, UK's definition of a social enterprise. It also has a certification process, so businesses that trade with a social purpose and meet SEEE UK's definition can register with the organisation, and there is a sliding scale of fees depending on the size of the organisation, which would allow you to badge yourself as a certified social enterprise, which obviously can be helpful with the kind of credibility point with stakeholders. Tech for good, again, something we sort of see quite often if there is a sort of tech IP element behind an organisation, but that's a movement that essentially believes that technology can really be used for the benefit of mankind more generally, tackling the biggest sort of social issues that we have at the moment, and looking to create the right sort of business environment to make those sort of innovations happen. And B Corp, as we've already mentioned, but that's operated by B Labs as the organisation that sort of takes responsibility and acts in the regulatory fashion for maintaining and awarding B Corp status to those businesses that meet the sort of relevant points threshold on its questionnaire. So just to run through quickly some legal checklists for setting up and launching a social business. First and foremost, we have your articles of association, so the core governing document that you will have as an organisation. You can set up a company with entirely model articles that are just given to you by Companies House. They're enshrined in the Companies Act 2006. So if you just want to get something up and running and then sort of tinker behind the scenes to make it sort of fit for purpose a little bit later on, you can absolutely do that. Alternatively, you could look to sort of create bespoke articles of association for you from the word go. And you might find that particularly useful if, for example, you wanted to really explicitly enshrine and set out your social or environmental mission for the company, because that isn't something that would be included with the model articles. You may also want to have a think around some other elements to the company as well. So thinking particularly about asset locks. So if you wanted to operate almost as a charity without needing the sort of rigmarole of registering with the Charity Commission, you could look to ensure that the assets of the company are only used in furtherance of your social purpose, and that in the event of the company being wound up, that rather than being distributed to the members or shareholders, that those assets are then passed on to another nominated non-profit body. Equally, if you were looking to impose any caps on dividends, if you opted for a company limited by shares, the articles will be the place where you set out what that restriction would be and the relevant level that you decide is appropriate. Your articles of association are a public document, so they will be publicly available and searchable at Companies House. And worth noting as well that if you're quite free to change and adapt the articles of association as the business develops. That's quite normal, but the process for doing so is one that needs a 75% approval decision from your shareholders or members. So it's not a decision that can be taken just by the directors if your directors are different to your members or shareholders. Sometimes they'll be the same people, and in which case you're sort of squaring the circle. It's the same people around the table. But if you do have that governance split between who your directors and who your members or shareholders are, then, as I say, that decision needs to sit with the shareholders or members. As I mentioned, it is a very quick process to set up a company. We've got a £12 incorporation fee, so there's no real financial hurdle to getting a company off the ground. Companies House does offer a slightly more expensive same-day incorporation process if you were in a particular rush to get a company set up, but otherwise we're looking at sort of a 3 to 5 day turnaround to have a company set up. And the form that you would need to complete for that, form INO1, is again available from Companies House, and that's all fairly sort of self-explanatory. It's just sort of setting out who are the directors, what will the registered office of the company be, if it's a company limited by shares, what's the initial shareholding that the company have, if it's a company limited by guarantee, what will be the amount that the initial members are offering to guarantee. So again, that sort of nominal £1 figure or the like. Worth noting as well, if you are interested in the community interest company model, the CIC regulator has its own model documents for each of those 3 types of KICs that I mentioned. And really, essentially, you would need to adopt one of those model documents, albeit you can obviously tweak the objects wording for the community purpose that you are looking to adopt, but otherwise they are pretty sort of off the shelf, which can make it easier. But as I say, if you were looking for something that was a bit more flexible, then perhaps the KIC model wouldn't quite be right for you. Also useful to think about your company name at the point you are ready to register. So worth checking, is the name available? Is there anything that really sort of looks a bit too similar for comfort? Because you wouldn't potentially want to find yourself at the end of a cease and desist letter from a company that perhaps already was operating with that name or with a registered trademark. So just a little bit of kind of due diligence as to what's already out there can be really helpful and save problems further down the line. Now, getting into a little bit more of the nuances of the operational governance for a social enterprise. If you do have a split between your directors and your members or shareholders, you may want to think about adopting a shareholders agreement in a company limited by shares, or a members agreement in a company limited by guarantee. Now, that's a private document, so that wouldn't be available at Companies House. It's a private contract to manage the relationship between those members or shareholders amongst themselves, and then between them and the company. So just to give you an example, in a shareholders agreement, for example, you would typically look to set out the basis on which you would allow a shareholder to sell their shares. So rather than allowing, if I was a shareholder in a business, me to sell my shares to my next door neighbour, if you were a fellow shareholder, you might actually want first right of refusal, that if I wanted out of the business, I sold my shares to you, and therefore we don't sort of dilute the shareholding pool by bringing unexpected third parties on board. So things like that can be sort of set out contractually between the parties. Post setup, once you have an entity, then you're probably ready to sort of start turning your attention to, what is this business going to look like going forward? How am I actually going to start delivering what I want to, and achieving the impact and scale that I want? So a few sort of practical checklists here would be terms and conditions. So if your business is underpinned by the delivery of goods or services, you will need to contract with third parties to deliver said goods or services. So having a sort of standard set of terms to outline the basis on which you will do that would be really helpful. Other commercial agreements that you might need to have within the organisation could be, as I say, consultancy agreements. If you need to bring consultants on board to look to sort of outsource the delivery of certain elements at the outset. Employment, if you are ready to think about taking on employees, there's obviously employment contracts that we'll need to think about, but obviously you would also need some initial policies to function as an employing entity. So a grievance policy, a disciplinary policy as a bare minimum. If you are a company limited by shares, a growth and investment, thinking about, as I say, the sort of shareholders agreement, but also if there is any other sort of wider share impact documents that we need to develop, and think about how you look to start sort of pitching your company to potential investors. So what's your slide deck for your sort of, your elevator pitch for the organization? What type of organizations will you initially look to approach to sort of get some funding behind the organization? Data protection, you never get very far these days without some sort of reference to GDPR. So does your organization deal with data as a starting point? If you're dealing with beneficiaries down on the ground, what's the relationship there? Are you holding their personal data? Is that potentially needing to be transferred to any other organizations? What's your sort of privacy policy for anybody that needs to sort of interact with your organization? Even if you're employing people as well, what are you doing with your employees' data? How are you dealing with the way that you, as I say, interact with them as a data controller? So depending on the nature of the business, as I say, there might be some points to think through there. So really, that sort of brings me to the conclusion of my element of what I wanted to talk through today. Just a couple of points that I thought might be useful for you to take away. Obviously, Jane will be circulating the slides, and hopefully we have some time for a few questions. But I will also just leave you with a couple of offerings. So Taylor Vinters have a pop-up clinic for social entrepreneurs, link here. So if you have any questions or sort of something crops up a few days down the line, for example, and you think, actually, I'd just like to sort of run that by someone, we're very happy to have a free half-an-hour chat. So please do feel free to use the link, which will be circulated afterwards as well. You can get in contact, and myself or one of my colleagues we're very happy to have an initial chat with you. And we have also developed a social venture handbook, which again is freely available from our website, and I will circulate some links as well. But we've sort of collated that. It will touch upon a number of the issues that we've discussed here today, but it also provides a little bit more flesh on the bones for certain sort of commercial elements as well that founders particularly find useful to think about going forward. So yes, just a couple of takeaway points there that might be useful, but otherwise I am very happy to take some slides, some questions. Sorry.
Thank you for that presentation. It was very helpful. Could we just go back to the part, my colleague and I, my colleagues on today, we're just in the process of setting up a CIC, so we're doing the EN01 form, the CIC 36, we're getting our memorandum of articles and everything ready. It was about paying ourselves as a CIC. There was, I missed that part. Could you just go over, because you said there was 3 opportunities as a CIC, and my granddaughter came in just on the one that's the most important about pay.
No, that's
I mean, you know, we're not
fine.
going to be a big organisation, but obviously we need a little bit of money,
of course,
to run it.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I would say, regardless of the type of CIC that you are adopting, you are perfectly entitled to earn a salary in your position. What we normally say is that it's a reasonable salary, given that
Yes.
it's a social business. But I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem. So, you, as I say, if you're going for a company limited by shares option,
no, we're going by company limited by guarantee.
Right, so it'll just be the salary for you. Then,
Lovely.
but that's absolutely fine. But I was just going to, for anybody else who's thinking of a KIC limited by shares, you would also then, if you go for the dividend cap option, have the option to pay yourself some dividends as well as being salaried. But yeah, anything that's reasonable for a salary, absolutely fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tom has his hand raised as well.
Hello there. Yes, thanks very much for your presentation. I'm just wondering about the idea I have involves retail, and in that I'm interested as to the perception of retail, whereby the word charity looms quite large. I think in the general populace, they will buy something if it is for a charity, where I think generally people, a lot of the other social enterprise, etc., people aren't familiar with that. Can you give me any examples? I'm always interested in case studies. Can you give me a company that deals in a retail setting that operates as a CIC and any other? Because basically the idea, people will more readily give or buy something if it's for charity purposes, and are less probably interested unless it's an absolutely cracking idea. And I've seen these things, I can't remember the name of the company, the toilet roll company from Australia.
Yes, yeah, who gives a
they're at 50%, and that's a cracking idea, and obviously done very well and been much copied. But
yeah, there are certainly some really good examples out there, Tom. And it's a really interesting question, actually. One example I would give you that absolutely flies off the tongue for me is a community interest company. It's called Love Welcomes. So really fantastic company. They are based in the UK, but operate internationally. So what they do is, Abby, the founder, did work very closely with Syrian refugees based in Greece, and she was working with them to sort of produce fabrics, woven items and the like, and that's now sort of developed into a really blossoming business that's now sort of working with Palestinian refugees, obviously the existing Syrian refugees. They have a base in London as well, where they're working with refugees in the UK, and it is a retail model, but they've had some absolutely fantastic successes in sort of celebrity partnerships, for want of a better word. So they've done some collaborations with Banksy, with Bono for a very fetching guitar strap, Margot Selby for some sort of designs for homeware interiors. So by all means, go and have a look at them. I mean, their website is beautiful, but I mentioned earlier on the sort of theory of change as a way of sort of really bringing your impact to the fore and what you're looking to do. Love Welcomes has a fantastic flow diagram that so neatly encapsulates what their theory of change is, and that's a really great way, I think, of giving a hook for potential purchasers, stakeholders, any other sort of entities that you might want to work with, as to this is what we do, this is how we are a bit different. Because the charity model, I completely take your point that consumers will see that. I mean, that in itself is unless you're sort of dealing and buying something directly as a new good from a charity shop, will be a commercial partnership, which in itself is very heavily regulated by contractual arrangements between the corporate and the charity, and you know, you have sort of solicitation statements and have to be very careful about the way that things are worded and whatnot. So that's a little bit of a different kettle of fish. Can I think of any other examples? Goodness. I think, I'm not sure if they're a kick, but there's a Worth, which I believe is another sort of social. So that's WEARTH. Oh goodness, Elvis and Cressner, I believe. They sort of take repurposed fire hoses and turn them into sort of luxury handbags and things like that. So it's goodness.
I was going to mention Elvis and Cress because their website is again very good, because it's not just about oh, look at the nice donations we give to firefighters charity. They talk all about how items are used in recycling. They talk about their supply chain, and it's the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And another one I would mention as well, depending on the impact piece, would be from Babies with Love, which again I believe is a kick. It has beautiful baby paraphernalia, so you know, onesies and toys and whatnot. But they have partnered with SOS Children's Villages, so a registered UK charity, that and basically they will pass on their distributable profits to SOS, which in turn obviously is using it in furtherance of its charitable object. So there's still that sort of impact flow down, but from baby, you know, and Babies with Love, you know, ethically sources all its materials. You know, it's still absolutely a social business in the way it operates, but the key element is the way it's sort of then passing on its profits. So hopefully that's a few examples.
No, thank you, and thanks everybody else putting things in the chat as well. I don't want to be greedy, but one question that might help everybody on here, regardless of the nature of your setup of what it is, CIC, B Corp, social enterprise, in terms of if you're a startup, are you still eligible easily for any government startup grants or entrepreneurial relief or benefit or anything?
Gosh, yes. Well, so social investment tax relief is still knocking around. And I think my understanding is that that's more sort of aimed at companies that are limited by shares, obviously. It's always been a bit of a damp squib, if I'm honest, in terms of take up. So yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of seeing, putting the feelers out, but there may be some, but if you are, I think probably, well, dependent on whether you're a company limited by guarantee or a company limited by shares. If you're by guarantee, put the feelers out with grant funders, because there certainly are a wide range of grant funders that would look to support a social enterprise. If limited by shares, there are some quite sophisticated impact investors out there now. Mustard Seed, Clearly So. It's becoming a bit more of a buoyant market of organisations that are prepared to marry up with the vision of an organisation. They're not looking at the sort of traditional, you know, put some money in and then I want an exit in the next sort of 3 to 5 years. So
no, okay. As ever in my businesses in the past, it's always been annoying, be it dealing with banks or whatever, when you find out later on that you could have got this if you'd have only known about it, asked for it. And I think that's, well, it's always was frustrating, even with a large business. Anyway, thank you for your time. I'll let everyone
no, no problem.
Okay, Christine's got a question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with the startup costs, I totally agree with Tom. It's really frustrating because it sort of says startup costs, and when you go to the organisations, it's really more joining their program or whatever, getting a few free courses. And that's the startup cost, which is helpful. But yeah, I've never come across any money yet. If you have, please let me know.
Anchor as well, got a question?
Yeah, I mean, for people who have Bates experience already or not. So my organization is not incorporated at the moment. What is the order of setting up a bank account and incorporating?
Yeah, you need to incorporate before you can set up a bank account.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Tom, was that another question or your hand still up?
Oh.
It's all right, just checking.
I've got loads of questions actually. I'll let everybody else dive in, but I'll be greedy, sorry.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone? No? Okay. But what we'll do is obviously we'll send around the slides, and I'll send a link to Emma's really useful pop-up clinic so you can have a follow-up consultation if you feel that'd be useful for you. I'll also send you, we've got various links and resources on our website, which might help some of the different questions you've got. But huge thank you, Emma, for a really, really good talk, and hope that's really helped some of you on your journey. And hopefully see some of you at some of our other webinars.